So when I learned that I was going to have the opportunity to introduce these two, I did some Wikipedia research and quickly learned that to give a adequate introduction, I would leave us 10 or 15 minutes to talk about other things, because between the two of them, they've won most prizes. So I'm going to do this, make this cursory. So Patty Limerick is a historian of the American West and also an applied historian. She was a MacArthur Fellow and was recently confirmed by the U.S. Senate in the National Humanities Council, which I think makes you the only person, the only Obama nominee to have been confirmed at all for anything.
It took 3 years and 10 months, and it was very hurtful when they said, well, you're not actually considered a controversial appointee.
Right. So Merrick Garland needs some advice from Patty Limerick.
I'm standing by for him.
I would also say her book kind of renewed, brought back, reinvigorated the history of the American West and taught us all to think in terms of colonialism more than of the wild and romantic frontier. So she really changed the way the history of the American West was done. Dave Goulson is an entomologist. He is, in fact, a professor of bumblebees, says his job description. He's also the founder of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and his love for natural history and, more generally, ecology is infectiously conveyed in two beautiful books, A Sting in the Tail and A Buzz in the Meadow, which are both lovely and I would recommend. So, I learned last year at the Jaipur Literature Festival what a literature festival is for. It had always struck me as a sort of ironic or paradoxical idea. And literature is made in solitude, and it is mostly taken in either in solitude or in relatively intimate groups. So the idea that you would want to get lots of people who spend lots of time alone with books together in the same place was strange to me. And what I learned last year at this event was that unpredictable events can generate conversations that would otherwise never arise. And that can be really valuable. It can sort of take you off the track, the book talk that you've been giving, the same conversation you've been having for years. This year, the unpredictable event, I think for the three of us, was the abstract for this talk, for this conversation, which is extremely ambitious and broad. So I want to start with that to kind of orient us. Here's the abstract. We didn't write this. This was I think actually this was also unpredictable. Written for the third panelist who's not here, but we're going to talk about it. As the blue planet encounters red flags, carbon-intensive economies continue to dictate policology, while environmentalists struggle for humble achievements. The policies and practices of governments, corporations, and other large institutions have immense implications for our planet's ecosystem. How can they be tipped toward adaptive resource management, equilibrium, and sustainability? So the three of us are going to figure that out in the next 45 minutes. So let me begin by asking if, first, is this an accurate characterization of where we are in relation to our environment? Is it the case that carbon-intensive economies continue to dictate policy and impact ecology while environmentalists struggle for humble achievements? Patty?
As an historian, I should be able to answer that, but don't get your hopes up, because I am very aware of the many ways in which the circumstances under which we live are so excellent, that polio is almost gone, that people who used to cross the overland trail and actually perish at a terrible rate from cholera, that so much of that has died down, and we live in a territory where people really were in an awful state, life-threatening state in periods of drought, and now we're in a episodically in a drought, and we're still hydrated. So there are things about our lives. I've called it the last 100 years the era of improbable comfort made possible by a truly astonishing but taken for granted infrastructure. And that is not a household phrase yet, but it should be, because that's where we have been. The second time, no, that's not right. The fourth time you say it, it just comes off your tongue. So I don't want to go into lamentations and nostalgia over how wonderfully human beings lived on the planet for millennia until our miserable time, because there's so much that has happened for opportunity and people in that. And I do think that the climate change scientists, I'll say this just to anticipate that, I do not think they are wonders at successful human communication. I will say that about climate scientists. And I'm very sad about that, because there's so much at stake that to not have communicators at the top of their game of communication, that's really been a dilemma. So this is what I choose not to say in public, and here we go. I don't know how you can avoid despair over some of the circumstances of our times, just to think. Really alarming prospects for the coastlines. We'll just go with the coastlines and stop there. And very little indication of societal ability or will, or certainly leadership's capacity to get us to address that. So as to whether we should be targeting the large institutions, well, we better target them. And we can get back to this, but I have a lot of faith in public relations as a good motivator for companies and industry to, and I understand it can be thought of as greenwashing, but I can see a lot more value in that. But what I do not like about our panel's statement, or whatever it is that we have there, is that it really leaves consumers and individuals a pretty paltry role to play. So here's a confession. I bought a Tesla. And when I bought a Tesla, it had a really stupid thing in the license plate area that said no emissions. Well, that was a stupid thing, because no emissions where I am. Right. But there'd better be something happening somewhere in electricity production for my Tesla and me to go anywhere. So that seemed to me like the height of, this is not helping a consumer understand herself, to sell her a really nice car and to say no emissions, as if somehow or other I'm Pontius Pilate at that moment. My hands are washed. I'm free to drive around without any. I can look in horror and contempt at the rest of you as I am distanced from my site of energy production. So there's the first really self-reproachful statement you've ever heard from a Tesla owner. So, and that's, which wasn't what you asked me to talk about. So okay, I'll stop now.
I don't know how to follow that, really.
I don't know how.
I don't have a Tesla yet. So it's absolutely true that people on average in the world today enjoy a standard of living that we've never seen before, most of us, especially in the Western world. But it seems to me as an ecologist that there's a real danger that people will look back on this as a kind of golden era and struggle to forgive us for really screwing it all up for them. If you look at what's happening to nature, to biodiversity, it's terrifying. So there was a study published by the World Wildlife Fund 2 years ago where they estimated how many individual vertebrates there are on the planet and how it's changed over time. So vertebrates, mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. And they estimated that it halved between 1970 and 2010, which is well within my lifetime. I was 5 years old when that started. Give it another 40 years, what will be left? So there's just some slightly more specifics. Just a couple of days ago, there was a study came out which reckoned there are 1.5 billion fewer birds in North America than there were in 1970. So we're seeing wildlife around the world disappear. Currently, extinction rates are estimated to be running at something between 1,000 and 10,000 times the average historic rate, which means that we're losing between 3 and 30 species a day from the planet going extinct. So we inherited this amazing, we live on this funny little round rock in space with life just living on the surface of it. Life stretches a few meters down into the ground and a few meters up into the air. But basically, there's this little skin of life on a rock floating in the vastness of space. It's hundreds of billions of miles to anywhere else where we might conceivably live, and we will probably never be able to get there. So we really ought to regard this as it. This is what we have. And we were incredibly lucky to inherit it, with this wonderful world with all these amazing creatures living here. And so you'd think we'd look after it. You'd think we'd regard it as the most important thing there is. But actually, we don't seem to give a damn about the environment. We're treating it like a kind of cheap, disposable toy, which I find astonishing. And I must admit, I struggle to be overly optimistic as to how we're going to solve these issues anytime soon.
I have to speak a little bit as an historian and to say that we do give a damn, and several dams, maybe not enough dams. But if you look at this nation before the 1960s, the abundance of environmental laws and environmental regulations that are in existence now that were not here when I was born, it's pretty amazing. And I think we want to treat that with some kind of recognition, because otherwise it's just like whatever we do, we're just as bad off as we were. I actually, years ago in the library, I was a tutor for in the adult literacy program, and I had a client who had considerable psychiatric troubles and was never going to work in a job. And I had my greatest moments of just thinking, I would sometimes get a little despairing, and I'd think, oh, why am I bothering? Albert is never going to get a job. He's never going to be a productive member of society. But he was learning to read for the first, he was 54 or something. He was learning to read for the first time. And I just thought, I don't really care about the scale here. This is, we're getting somewhere. We're doing something. So, and that's a micro moment of just thinking, we have to acknowledge the things that are moving somewhere. And 50 years ago, you could certainly say 50 years ago, it looks as if those people didn't give a damn about the environment, but all of the environmental regulations and laws since then add up to something? Apparently not. Well, that's an interesting fact. So don't bother trying to do anything, because it's going to go nowhere. So I guess we're back.
I did not say give up and let's just all go home and
I know, but I thought we would have a livelier discussion if I spoke for you, and then you could correct yourself. I guess.
I mean, of course, it's true that we do have, that there have been some steps taken, but they're nowhere near enough. It's just tinkering around the edges, it seems to me. I mean, unless we do something pretty dramatic, it's going to be too late. There are so many huge issues looming, not just species disappearing, but soil erosion on a staggering scale around the world, the whole climate change issue, which, unless we do something pretty dramatic, is going to make big chunks of the surface of the globe uninhabitable. I could go on and on. Aquifers being emptied, in California, they're pumping water from deeper and deeper in the ground every year. There are so many issues where we're heading straight towards a kind of catastrophe in the not too distant future. So, yeah, we've done some good things, but boy, we need to get busy and do a lot more good things quick, don't we?
May I just really be irritating now and compare you to the Presbyterian missionaries in the Pacific Northwest in the 1830s? Because here we go. So probably not a flattering comparison, or maybe it is, I don't know. There were Catholic missionaries and there were Presbyterian missionaries in the Pacific Northwest. The Catholic missionaries were sort of, well, we've all sinned and we have forms of dealing with that sin and we'll help you through that. In the meantime, good to meet you. So the Catholic missionaries were pretty pleasant people, and they had a higher...
Is this you? Are you the Catholic missionary?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm not any missionary at all. I'm just a miserable armchair quarterback, is all I am. But the Presbyterian ministers, the Narcissa and Marcus Whitman and others, they had a whole, you are a heathen living in deep, deep darkness, and you are really a mess. You were just a mess. That was their approach to converting Indian people to proselytism. So which side did better? The Whitmans were murdered in 1847, which is an interesting outcome to missionary activity. The Catholics there's still warmth and affection for some of those Catholic priests in that area. So I don't know. It's just other people have said it better than this ridiculous analogy might. But the environmentalist stance of darkness and gloom and despair, it's very Calvinist. It's really the sort of we are living in darkness and damnation, and you are showing few signs of redemption.
I'm not sure which of those outcomes I prefer. I don't know if I like the missionary who got murdered better or the missionary who succeeded. I might like the missionary who got murdered, actually.
Well, although...
I want to see if we can direct ourselves toward some kind of very concrete vision of a change that would be significant and realistic. So we're confronted with these overwhelming numbers. You know, Dave just ran through some. I just read that 30% of the wilderness in South America vanished in the last 20 years. They're big numbers, and they can be crushing. And so with two visionary people here, I want to take advantage of the opportunity to ask, what's an idea you have? What's a vision of the future where something changes that really makes a difference? Who wants to go first?
I'll give it a try. I must admit I was quite nervous about this whole session because we are supposed to come up with an answer, and I'm struggling. There's different ways it could, in theory, happen. I mean, one of the big problems, it seems to me, is that the environmental issues are not on most people's agenda at all, despite all the figures I was just spewing out. Most people either are unaware, or they find it so depressing they deliberately ignore it, or they just don't care. They just expect their food to arrive in the supermarket. And so we had elections last year in the UK. The environment just wasn't discussed. It was all about immigration and the economy and the health service, how we're going to fund that. None of those things are going to matter if we destroy the environment, but people don't seem to be bothered about it. It's not something that's high on most people's agendas. Of course, the people here are a very non-random selection of society, and it probably is high on theirs. But so I guess the question then is, how do we make these issues? How do we persuade people that this is something that's really important, that actually we should be just making our decisions about who to vote for on the basis of, you know, who's going to look after the environment, rather than, you know, what they're going to do about the economy or whatever. But how do you do that? I don't know. How do you persuade millions, billions of people that the environment is important? It seems self-evident, but nonetheless, at the moment, they don't seem to care to me.
So you just used the number billions. Could you apply what you were just saying to the developing world and the people who have not reached a stage of comfort and ease in their material circumstances? And what is to say, I mean, we've got lots of people have said that for the first world to say to the third world, we've had quite a remarkable time of it, but not you. I don't know how exactly that works to talk to the people who've lived in deprivation and inequality.
But the simple truth is that we're going to have 10 billion people by 2050. They can't all live like we do. Mm-hmm. It just isn't possible. So it seems quite likely that the outcome is that we'll all have much worse lives in 50 years from now, that our children and grandchildren will grow up in an impoverished world where much of the soil is gone, water's running out, the climate's changing dramatically, and there'll be much, much more poverty then than there is now. So, I mean, I agree it seems perhaps hypocritical for people with very comfortable lives at this kind of potentially a peak of comfort for humanity in the West, to lecture other people about how they should live. But something is going to give sometime soon, and we simply can't all live a life of luxury with 10 billion people on the planet.
What I was going to offer as I don't know if I'd call it a solution, but I think the narrowing of the gap between production and consumption, so that people who are, well, when you were mentioning it, oh, well, all the food will just show up in the stores, that's not good as an attitude of complacency. And so to just have not a sense, I mean, I guess I would almost yearn for a sense of sacrament, that when you were given food, which many societies on the planet have taken the sharing of food as a sacrament, as a thing that affirms the value of life. And so the supermarkets really don't give you places to kneel and worship, which is kind of a shame, because that sort of, where did this come from? And we just last weekend, we were in the Central Valley, where there are really complicated issues of water, because indeed we are all pretty much tied into food production in the Central Valley of California. So whatever's going on with those aquifers, it's totally appearing in King Soopers and alfalfas, probably, for that matter. So just that sense of narrowing the distance, so that every time you look at a grape, you have a thought about the origins of that grape, and you're tied to that. But then this last topic, I think the disconnect between the rich and the poor has to be as vigorously addressed in our thinking. If all we do is connect consumers to producers, okay, that's big. That's really important, and that does allow a form of taking your own life seriously in this context.
I would love to see one of the big changes I think we somehow need to make happen, although I have no idea how to make it happen, is to see a huge shift in how we produce food, as well as how we regard food. I mean, the food waste is just astonishing. Mm-hmm. So.
We have a hit, ladies and gentlemen. We finally
something like 35-40% of all the food grown in the world just gets wasted. It doesn't get consumed by anybody, which is insane. And on top of that, we eat too much in the West, way more than is good for us. So we have an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. We eat too much meat, which we all know is bad for us. And that obviously is more damaging to the environment to produce. So persuading people to change those things would be great. Then you wouldn't need to do as much of I mean, essentially, all that biodiversity loss that I was talking about is very largely driven by the growth of intensive farming, this model of farming that we've been conditioned to accept, that the only way we can feed the world is vast crops drenched in chemicals. But actually, you can make a pretty good argument that those very systems are not sustainable in the long term and are undermining the ability of the planet to support us. So we need to move away from big agribusinesses owning huge chunks of the land, buying up third world countries, and half of Brazil. The reason all that forest has been lost in South America is largely because it's being bought up by big agro companies to grow soybeans, which are then shipped to China to feed to pigs to produce pork for the growing demand for pork in China. It's a crazy way of feeding the world, and also is displacing people that would have made a living from that land. So I don't know how we do it, but I would love to see us move more towards local food production, more sustainable food production, smaller scale farming, organic farming, permaculture, agroforestry, and so on. Thank you.
An organic farmer in our presence here.
All of which are viable ways of producing lots of food, much more sustainably than we currently do. But there's a big vested interest, a very powerful lobby in the current farming system, those big companies. I mean, I hesitate to mention the Monsantos and Bayers and Syngentas and so on, but they are the people that are driving the way we produce food around the world, and they're doing it just to make money. They don't give a damn about the future of the environment, soils, biodiversity, or anything else, bees. They're happy to just make money, as far as I can see, and somehow we need to rein that in.
Well, that's where I would go for my pitch on public relations and communications, that this may not make your spirit soar. In fact, I'm pretty sure that your spirit will not soar, but the people who work on sustainably produced minerals have gotten pretty far with gold, that if they persuade a gold company, Tiffany's, to sell gold that is produced with minimal environmental impact, with remediation, with fair labor conditions, they can charge higher prices for that gold, because people who are giving, I'm fingering my wedding ring here, because you don't really want to wear the world's sins. It's not with this emblem of the world's sins, I thee wed. That's not what you want to be saying there. So that you can really use sentiment there to push a company to recognize that they will do their bottom line a favor if they take that up. So, and if we are too pure to consider such forms of motivation, then we'll get what we deserve from that. But I think there's a lot to be done with that way to admire. And I also want to give a pitch for a writer, David Masumoto, who is a farmer in the Central Valley and who is a spectacular writer. He wrote a book called Epitaph for a Peach, which is wonderful. And in that he says that he solved many of his problems. He took much of his life force weeding, and he was weeding under very hot conditions and having his workers weed under those conditions. And he solved the problem in many ways by simply redefining what he thought was a weed. And then he had fewer things to pull out, and the neighbors said, "What has happened to you? You've fallen apart. Look at your ratty fields there." But in fact, the plants that he wanted were growing, and it didn't really matter what was growing at their base particularly. So he's a really, in terms of what it might mean to really take up agriculture in a fresh and better way, his writing should be a literary. I recommend him for another occasion here.
But we can only, so the whole gold production example, you could obviously apply the same thing to agriculture. And to some extent, there are lots of people trying to do that. But at the moment, most consumers do not base their shopping choices on what's locally produced or seasonal or been sustainably produced. Look at the organic market; it's still very small. It doesn't seem to be growing particularly rapidly. It comes back to persuading people that the environment matters, that actually their shopping decisions are important. And if enough people wouldn't buy the food that was produced in these unsustainable ways from big farms, if you didn't buy your food, stuff that was imported from the other side of the world or whatever, then it would stop. But you've got to persuade people to make those decisions and to pay perhaps more for food that hasn't damaged the environment so much.
Perhaps this has a lot to do with our storytelling. I mean, we're at the Jaipur Festival of Literature, and Patty, you mentioned the importance of public relations and potentially driving corporate choices. And the gold ring, when you started offering your numbers, Dave, you had the fraction of vertebrates that have gone extinct in the last, what, 30 years?
No, sorry. No, I was talking about the number of individual animals, not species,
right?
Individual creatures.
Okay. I wonder if such numbers, in some ways, work against us in that they are they're crushing, and perhaps part of reinstilling a sense of sacrament with relation to our food or making us care about bugs, it has to do with narrative. So I read just encountered a very devastating narrative yesterday of, we're about to lose our smallest cetacean, our smallest whale and porpoise. It's about this big. It's a porpoise. It lives at the northern Gulf of California. It's about to go extinct. There are 50 individuals left. And somehow that might be more gripping as a narrative. So how much of this struggle has to do with how we tell the story, and how far can storytelling go in giving us the corporations behaving the way we want and consumers behaving the way we want?
After you. I never quite know how to pitch these things, how to communicate these messages, because I'm aware that there is a danger of just turning people off. If it's too doom and gloom, then they give up. They just think, oh, well, sod it then, I'll pay my attention to something else because there's nothing I can do anyway, it's all too bad. But on the other hand, I think there's very few people in the world actually have any grasp at all how serious it is, and we have to, my take is we have to tell people that if they actually realised how much we were damaging the planet, they'd sit up and take notice, and they'd be concerned. And the big problem is that they simply don't appreciate what's happening. But I understand. I mean, there's a good reason why we don't see rainforest destruction on the news anymore. It's because people don't want to see it. They've heard about it. It's old news. It's still happening, but somehow it turns people off, I guess. I'm not I don't know. I don't have an answer as to what the best way to engage everybody is. But I go for telling it how I see it and hope that works. I don't know.
There's a fellow, Randy Olson, who has spoken once or twice in Boulder, who was a coral reef biologist at the University of New Hampshire, Harvard PhD, and he became despairing about the forms of communication that scientists use to tell their stories. So he left his tenured job and he went to USC and he got a degree in improvisational theater and in movie making. And he has done some really remarkable stuff on this. His first book is called Don't Be Such a Scientist. His second book, just out, which goes directly to your point, is called Houston, We Have a Narrative. So there is a person who's really saying, by how you manage yourself as a person in public and how you arrange your information. He has a wonderful thing about and, but, therefore as a way of communicating. So I think I'm going to take this occasion, because it is a great one. We have a most excellent scientist here and somebody who's really just put everything that a person should put into a cause, and seems to experience frustration from the outcome of that. So what would you say to a pretty brief but intensive course in improvisational theater on how you could you might be able to say exactly the same numbers, but to say them in a tone and spirit that suggests possibility, that suggests things that a person might do, and might include stories about things that people had done, so that because I think your affect, if I might use such a term, is really, and that's where, and if that's who you are and that's how you feel, then you should be honest about that. But until you decide that you might want to be a little dishonest in a way that is manipulative and cheerful. So it's just a...
Well, so had you been here for my talk this morning, then you would have heard me finish it off by talking about all the things that you can do to help. I was talking specifically about bees, and I started out with all the doom and gloom, but then I finished by saying, well, actually, the good news is, you can get out there planting flowers, not use pesticides, make shopping choices and all sorts of other things that everyone can get involved in. And I haven't given up, but I think we do need to be blunt about what the problems are. I'm not sure about the improvisation. I can't even say it, let alone do it. Improvisational theatre. Yeah, I might leave that one if you don't mind.
For whatever reason, speaking of that has made you smile, and which might. It's not the first time you've done that in this session, but it's just a thought that there's something about, not necessarily the content, but, and so I'm offering public relations advice to major corporations, and now I'm offering it to you.
There is a danger, though, from something you were saying earlier. You were saying, we should be more proud of what we have achieved, kind of pat ourselves on the back for the good things. But there is a danger in that people think, we've actually solving these problems, and we're nowhere near solving them. We need to do a heck of a lot more. So you can go too far in being kind of giving the impression that you're complacent, that you think it's all sorted.
I don't think the self-congratulations mode was but just to say, every time, if I can go back to that experience, because that was the starkest one, a very disabled person turning a page and being better able to read every 5 minutes we were together. That was empowering and great, but no occasion to say, well, now we've solved the world's problems, or now we can, but just that sense that every move means something, and they aggregate. That's really, I think, all I was saying with that, not the moment where we cross the finish line and do our touchdown dance. I don't see that prospect right away.
I'm not sure if the improvisational theater is the scientist's job, or whether... I was saying to you both that I had just read the last paragraph of The Origin of Species and was reading abstracts of climate modeling papers, and there's a marked contrast. The last paragraph of The Origin of Species is rhetorically powerful and poetic, and it's clear that it's written by someone who has a public relations agenda in mind. Not so the abstracts for recent papers on climate modeling. But maybe that's because the sciences now are at a stage of maturity where a sophisticated language is called for within the discipline, and it's someone's job to take a message from within the discipline to the broader audience. It's the improvisational actor's job. But is it the scientist's job?